You know, when I was a kid, I used to worry a lot about growing up. When I turned 2, I was really anxious because I doubled my age in a year. I thought, if this keeps up, by the time I'm 6, I'll be 90. When I got a little older, I was still pretty worried, but about something else entirely, namely communism. See, I grew up in the United States during the 70s and 80s, which was an absolute boom time for Cold War paranoia and propaganda about the communists. We were all absolutely terrified of the Russians. One of my friends actually had a bomb shelter in his backyard. According to the Reagan administration, the communists were on the verge of overrunning us from the south. Kind of like the swarms of killer bees and fire ants that were rumored to be on their way up from Mexico at about the same time. Like a lot of Americans, I was convinced we were on the brink of a nuclear holocaust. But it turned out that the government had basically been lying to us. Because just like that, the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War ended. And the entire communist threat just kind of evaporated overnight. I guess the contemporary equivalent would be waking up to discover the Muslim fundamentalists just weren't our enemies any longer. You know, in retrospect, all kinds of fears we have turn out to be completely unfounded. You had the whole Y2K thing and the bird flu scare. And throughout history, people have been convinced, time and again, that asteroids were going to smash into the Earth and kill us all. None of these fears ever amounted to very much. Maybe human beings are simply a paranoid bunch and have an inherent need to worry about things, however rational or irrational they turn out to be. If nothing else, all these various fears and phobias keep a lot of people busy. But the question is, how do we know if something's really worth worrying about? Take the threat of terrorism, for instance. We're all worried about the terrorists these days. But how much of a threat do they really pose to us? Did you know that more people are killed each year by rampaging elephants than by terrorists? More than 200 people are killed every year by elephants in India alone. In fact, in 2006, one single elephant in the Indian state of Assam killed 28 people before he was finally shot. That's the same as the entire number of Americans killed by terrorists in 2006 worldwide. So maybe we're worrying about the wrong thing. It makes you wonder, though, if our understanding of the world is so easily manipulated and distorted, how can we ever be sure what's true? In some cases, the gulf between fear and reality is even more extreme. Like all those doomsday cults you hear about. There was a great one recently that locked itself in a cave in Russia because they were absolutely convinced the world was going to end. They even had the specific date, in May of 2008. Well, the day came and went, and the world didn't end, and the last remaining members decided to chuck in the towel and eventually slinked out of the cave a few days later. They must have figured, well, maybe we got the dates a little wrong.
Hallelujah.
It must be pretty embarrassing to realize everything you believed about the world turned out to be totally incorrect. Granted, these people are complete lunatics, but it raises an interesting philosophical question about how human beings interpret the world. Because basically, pretty much everything people believe eventually turns out to be wrong. And even things we think are absolute certainties turn out to be nothing more than illusions. And I'm not just talking about government propaganda or the paranoid delusions of maniacs. History is littered with all kinds of crackpot ideas and theories, which were all considered reliable and certifiably true at some point, like phrenology or alchemy, or the law of spontaneous generation, or even creationism. With the benefit of hindsight, now they just seem preposterous. But think about it for a second. If virtually everything we believed in the past has turned out to be wrong, even though we were convinced it was true at the time, How can we be sure we've got it right this time? Back in the old days, sailors used to think that walruses were actually mermaids, and people found this a completely reasonable assertion. But chances are, in 50 or 100 years from now, pretty much everything we believe will seem just as absurd. But who knows what life will be like in 100 years? Because our predictions of the future usually turn out to be absurd as well. When I was a kid, everyone thought by the year 2000, we'd all be living in futuristic domed cities with no social problems, flying around in hovercrafts. That never quite materialized. Most people are still living in the same miserable slums they've always lived in. And as impossible as it is to predict the future, we can't even be sure we have an accurate view of the past either. Take our understanding of classical antiquity. For centuries, people have looked at the Greco-Roman aesthetic as the embodiment of purity and elegance. But as new research reveals, ancient monuments and sculptures were actually painted in all kinds of wild, garish colors, and weren't anything like the austere white marble creations that we've come to admire. It's just that all the paint wore off, so we didn't realize what we were looking at. Strangely, it turns out that the tacky, jumped-up fantasy of antiquity in places like Las Vegas and Atlantic City is a lot closer to the original than anyone could have imagined. But at the end of the day, human beliefs, whether fears or predictions or theories, or even ideas about the past, are basically just like fashion trends. They capture our attention for a while and seem pretty reasonable at the time. But then new ideas inevitably come along to replace the old ones. And when you look back at the old ones, they usually seem pretty ridiculous. Speaking of fashion, I've got a good joke for you. An octopus walks into a bar carrying a set of bagpipes. He sits down, bartender pours him a drink, and they get to talking a bit. Bartender points to the bagpipes and says, "So, you gonna play that thing later?" "Play it," says the octopus. "As soon as I can figure out how to get the pajamas off it, I'm gonna fuck it."